Schwartz here from Sales for Nerds, kicking off the Sales for Nerds podcast. If you feel more comfortable with SQL than sales calls, more at home writing test suites than proposals, more interested in crunching numbers than shaking hands, if you think networking should be about routers rather than cocktails with strangers, if you're more interested in debating code editors than negotiating deals, but somehow you ended up responsible for some of those sales and marketing activities, this is the podcast for you.
Today, I'm really happy to have Anil Dash on Sales for Nerds. Anil is a serial entrepreneur. He is currently the CEO of Fog Creek Software. And unless you're a super techie person, you may not have heard of Fog Creek, but the companies Trello and Stack Overflow have come out of them. And Anil is also, he served as an advisor to the Obama White House's Office of Digital Strategy. He has done a number of entrepreneurial ventures, and he was one of, I don't know if I could say the original bloggers, but he's been blogging for almost 20 years, back when blogging was some new cutting-edge thing. And he's one of those folks who has made a living both as a super hardcore programmer and as a salesperson, as an executive. So I wanted to welcome Anil here and get some thoughts on his journey and what we might learn from that. Thanks for coming, Anil.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
And we're doing a little bit of a different wrinkle today. We are not drinking wine for a couple of reasons. One, Anil does not drink. He does not even drink coffee. We're going to try to find some vices during this interview, but it might be hard.
Oh, there are plenty.
And it's also early in the morning, and I have a soccer game later, so this all actually coincided really well to not having wine. So I've actually got some Trader Joe's English breakfast tea in my mug. Anil, what are you drinking?
I am a black tea drinker. I'm not sure actually what kind this is, but I got to say, I think I like the ritual of making the cup of tea as much as I like whatever kind of tea it is.
So do you do like the loose leaf with the...
Oh, yeah. It's like I think taking that time to actually do it is a nice distraction. Maybe it's just keeping my hands busy while my gears are turning in my head.
I think that's a great point. And I have a couple of those infusers, and I always meant to get more into it. And unfortunately, I'm at a state now where having a cup of tea in the morning just doesn't do it for me. So I have a shot of espresso when I get up. And
Yeah, I think there are a lot of folks that need that kickstart in the morning.
So one of the interesting things, there's so many interesting things in your biography, but I always like to ask how people got started. And something that kind of I think is unusual about your path is you never graduated from college, and yet here you are, the CEO of this super successful software company. How did that work out in the beginning?
My path was very strange in a lot of ways, but I've been very fortunate. I think, working in tech really for me started as I was one of those kids where I was lucky enough my parents got a Commodore computer when I was a kid back in the 80s, and we had it around the house. And when I would get bored during summer vacation or whatever, I could go and tinker with it and start to learn what to do with it. So I really, in some ways, started coding when I was about 5 years old and having that computer in the house. And
nice.
And it just, it opened up the world to me. It was the thing where I was like, I can sort of master this, right? Like this is the thing where I can control everything and I know what's going on, and it clicked for me. It made sense. And that was a really, it was eye-opening. It was just such a nice thing to find a thing that made sense to me and that I loved and that I was good at. Because like any normal kid, like I played soccer, but I was like pretty terrible at it. So I was like, there's no way this is the path for me. And it was really great. And then, as I got older and it got, the internet came along, or the first online services, even before that, you started to find communities and connect to people, and you realize, oh, this is a box for talking to people, not just, a place to write software or apps. And that really just blew my mind. It opened things up for me. And I ended up, actually, the day after I graduated high school, I had deferred my admission to college. I started my first company the day after I graduated high school and was doing just basic computer consulting. Back then, you could offer to install people's printers, and that was a way to make $1.
Right.
And was hustling. Growing up in an immigrant family, you always learn like all the different ways to go out and try and support yourself. And so I just was stringing together people's networks or computers at their office, or like I said, plugging in their printers or fixing their Windows installation, whatever it was, and was off and running. And by the time I was supposed to, I told my folks I was deferring college for a year. By the time that year rolled around and I was supposed to go back to school, I went for a couple of weeks and I just had gotten the bug. I loved building stuff. I loved talking to customers. I loved being out in the world. And it's ironic because now that I run a business, like I look wistfully at like, wow, it'd be amazing to go back to school and get a chance to learn. But the grass is always greener. But I had just gotten the bug. I'd gotten hooked on building a business and trying to be an entrepreneur, and certainly on creating software. And all those things still are mesmerizing to me today, all these years later.
That makes a lot of sense. So how long did you do this computer consulting?
I did it for about 7 years. It evolved. Interestingly, at that era, while I was doing it, is really when the internet took off, because I started in the early 90s, and then the sort of popularization of the internet came along, and the web browser came along, and as a geek, I saw the World Wide Web, and I was like, oh, this is it. This is going to take over everything. And so it's just a question of how do you tap into that. And so I shifted into doing, really, rather than sort of bespoke software development, doing website development and things like that. And at the same time, I also, I was young still, and I had grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania, and I really wanted to come to New York City, to Manhattan, where I still live. And so I had sort of set off for New York, didn't know anybody, didn't have a job, had this kind of half stumbling company. I didn't really know how to grow a company. And just decided, let me try and be a web guy in New York City. And was lucky enough that at that time, in the sort of mid-late 90s, there was just enough opportunity that was enough to get a foot in the door. And I ended up getting to be the web guy in industries that I loved, like being in the music business or the publishing business and things like that.
Now, when you were doing this, you've been coding at this point already for 15 years or more. But how did you handle the sales and marketing?
Well, it was interesting. The job I had in high school, I remember being 16, and my folks were like, "Okay, time for you to get a real job," and I was like, "Sure." And I ended up talking to a guy who ran a company that sold software for construction companies. It was a vertical application that construction and architecture firms would use. And I just told him, I know how to do computers. I can, which was the thing you could say back then. Right. And I'll be the tech guy in the office. So he would go out and sell, and I would be, basically just putting together computers and installing software and that kind of stuff, like an intern kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, because he was, his name was Fred Burke. We're still friends, and he was twice my age. I was 17, he was 34. At that time, it seemed like a huge age difference. And his process in hiring people in his company was he would do a full sales training with them, no matter who they were, an intern, a new exec level hire, whatever. And so the first week on the job was incredible sales training. And it was opened my eyes, because I had always had, I think, a lot of geeks' view of what sales was, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, there's these slick-suited guys that go and lie to you to try and get you to take whatever they've got and
exactly.
Go back and make a buck. And I had honestly bought that view kind of hook, line, and sinker, and part of it is being very young. The view you get of a salesperson is based on the villain in a Muppets movie. You don't really get a view of what the job is. And he walked me through literally as a teenager, how to do sales and what it was to qualify a lead, and what it was to understand their needs and to educate, and when to say no to a deal, and just these real fundamentals and understanding overcoming objections. And it was just eye-opening, because I saw it as, what it is when done right, which was this way to build relationships that are valuable to people. And that was what I had it really clicked with what I saw software is doing, because the view of a lot of people critical of techies was oh, they're making these, we didn't even call them apps yet, right? They're making software, and its goal is to, part you with your money and take mm-hmm. your information and lock it into their system, in a proprietary way. And what I'd seen, the right way to make software, the ideal great way to make software, was you were solving a problem for somebody by having a dialogue with them about understanding their needs and creating exactly the right tools, or enabling them to have the right set of tools to solve a problem that would make their life better. And so there was this kind of humanity to what I thought of as the idealized versions of both making software and being in sales that really clicked. And both of them were not the conventional way of looking at it from outside the field.
That's such an interesting analogy, and it's funny because now software is so ubiquitous, we've sort of gotten used to it, but I do vaguely remember from back in those times when masses of people were buying computers and getting online for the first time that there was this sort of distrust of the intentions of these companies. In some cases, maybe with some good reason, but
yeah, I mean, you had that era was IBM and then later Microsoft that were the sort of big mistrusted companies, and now it might be Google and Facebook and Apple. But like the reasons were the same. So they have a lot of control, and also back then the popular media. Now we have like the Social Network, and you see like the founder of Snapchat dating a supermodel and whatever. Back then it was like Revenge of the Nerds, and these guys with the broken glasses, they're in the back and they resent you because you're cool and they're not. And it's like, well, that version of what it was to be somebody that liked technology, I think was a very sort of, it's still a stereotype that the industry is trying to outlive.
Yeah, it's funny. I hear from the kids today that there isn't the same kind of stigma attached to being good with computers that there was when we were growing up. So
no, couldn't be with everybody having a phone in their pocket, right?
We missed out on the era. But anyway, so basically you got this sales training walking into this guy's office almost by accident.
Yeah, it's incredible.
It's a
changed my life.
17-year-old, now know probably more about sales than most people out there today. And I think something that's very interesting you said is you not only sort of knew the tactical mechanics of the sales process, but you shifted your perspective on what the whole thing is about.
Yeah, I hadn't realized, and I mean that moment of being, just on the cusp of adulthood and all these things is about sort of seeing the wide world in a different way, I think in a lot of ways. And I think the timing was right for me to sort of open my mind a little bit. And this idea that like I could embrace things that I thought were not cool, and it's funny as like a super geeky computer programmer at that moment to be like, well, this other thing's not cool.
Right.
It was kind of ridiculous, but yeah, I think that the timing was really great. And also, getting a glimpse into, in that particular case, it was the construction industry or whatever that I was trying to help. But the idea that technology was really going to change the way people worked. And I mean, now we see it's changed our whole lives, but at that time, it was not obvious. Like you might have one person in an office that had a computer,
right?
And it sounds like 100 years ago, but it wasn't that long ago. But you just would have, oh, that's the person who does the spreadsheet stuff,
right?
And so to sort of see that change to where a lot of the work I was doing was taking an office from one person had a computer on their desk to everybody has a computer and they're all networked together and they can send each other email. And even just that of taking an office of people that had worked together for years and giving them the ability to instantly send each other messages about what they were doing and be able to search them and those things was such it's almost impossible to overstate now that we take all that for granted, what an upgrade that was in just the quality of life of people doing their work.
Right. It's funny, I had a work study job at one point in college where I was responsible for a small Novell network, just to date myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it was...
I know it well.
Right, it was like some people, and I had no idea, I didn't know it at all, but I could read a manual and I wasn't scared of the computer, right? Most of the people in the office were just like, yes, this is a computer, it's black magic.
And it's expensive and I'm going to break it.
Well, and the funny thing is, at one point, I had to replace a printer cartridge, and I still remember the first couple pages don't come out fully right.
Mm-hmm,
and so somebody decided that he would go in and try to fix this problem with his Swiss Army knife.
Oh, no. Uh-huh.
So you can imagine that did not go well. And it was just like, it's kind of like you're saying, it was a different time where just the notion of, hey, I get to sit down and type this out rather than handwriting it was maybe an improvement for a lot of people. Yeah,
absolutely. And just being able to fix a typo.
Yes, no whiteout.
Yep.
So you have this computer consulting company and you know how to sell stuff. And were there particular lessons that you got from Fred that you feel like, hey, if you don't know this, everyone listening should walk away with X, Y, and Z?
That's such a great question. I haven't thought about that in a long time. I think, this is the sort of like, there's nobody sort of more full of themselves than maybe a 17-year-old boy, which is what I was when I went in there. And the idea that overcoming objections was not a video game you're trying to win.
Okay.
And that it really was about listening to people and believing what they said and having a respect for their understanding of their problems. And this is something I think about even in terms of like being like a good neighbor or, or being a good citizen, whatever.
Right.
Is this thing of like, if you want to, like, I'm very, concerned about a lot of the social and civic impacts that technology has these days. And I think a lot of them are rooted in us not listening to, in the case of software creators, the users, but as a salesperson to the lead, the customer, the potential customer you're talking to. And what happens a lot of times is the presumption of I know better than you, your problems, or I have, in tech, a lot of what we call disruption is this sort of masquerading as like, no, I know what you need better than you do. Let me just tell you. And the justification these days is always looking at somebody like Steve Jobs, where they're like, oh, if they had asked people what they wanted back when they had a horse, they would have said a faster horse, but you got to invent the car. And it's like, well, yeah, sometimes you have that breakthrough. But sometimes people really do know what they want, and you need to listen to them and believe them and solve their actual problem as opposed to the one you think they have. And I think a lot of it came down to that sort of very thoughtful human version of sales that I was trained in. And later I got exposed to other sales environments that were much more so the classic criticisms where it wasn't that, and it was much more high pressure and not as thoughtful a selling culture. But I think that I was very, very, very fortunate that the first exposure I had to it was this very thoughtful and respectful human version of like listen to people, believe what they say about what their problems are and their challenges are, and really work hard to try and solve what their pain points are.
So when you go and start your own company, you already have a sales system or sales process in place.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I had done the sort of like basic Microsoft Excel spreadsheet of pushing people through each step of the sales cycle. And, I kept that very primitive model for a long time as just my way of like being able to build a business.
And did you do much marketing?
Initially, no. And part of it was like, it was a foreign world to me, especially by the time I came to New York. I wouldn't even have known how to sort of bang the drum about doing broad marketing. And because I was at that time mostly in a vertical market, I was able to sort of just network the way to it. So there was like the vendors that sold the tools. So you would just sort of go to them and they would get leads inbound and you would do a deal with them. But I think what I did learn, and it's interesting how this sort of coincided with the rise of social media. Years later, what I ended up doing with friends was we built a lot of the first social media and social networking tools. And what I realized was that was a much better fit than what I had sort of seen marketing as being. The idea of like the sort of untargeted, broad-based messages that you're trying to sort of launch out into the world and hope somebody responds to, and you have these very low conversion rates or response rates, always seemed really frustrating and expensive to me. And then after social media came along, you realize it's because they are. For me, the method of like having a conversation with somebody and having them respond to what you wrote or what you communicated with them about was a much more, it just intuitively felt right. Like I have no disrespect for people that do direct marketing or other things. I think those are incredibly valuable and important tool sets. But for me, it just didn't fit my personality or it didn't click for the way that I worked or thought. And in the process of building some of the first social media tools, we marketed them exclusively through using them. We blogged our way to getting customers for these things. And that made so much more sense. And of course, it built these deeper relationships where people felt like they knew you and they could respond to you. And interestingly, one of the people I connected with in that very early era, like 1999, 2000, the early blogging era, was Joel Spolsky, who had written one of the first sort of real tech blogs called Joel on Software, where he was on the one hand, talking about what's the right way to make great software, and on the other hand, talking about building a business by doing so. And the business that he was building, unbeknownst to me, was Fog Creek Software, where now today, because of that relationship we made through both of us writing about our work and sort of promoting it, we formed a friendship that led to me becoming CEO of that company, late last year.
So there's so many interesting things in that story, and I guess I'll working my way backwards. I still remember reading Joel on Software way back in the day. And now there's a lot of people who are sort of like thought leaders or influencers or whatever. But back then there wasn't a whole lot of people sort of talking openly about building their companies.
Not at all. I think he really, really was such a pioneer there. It's almost hard to overstate. He was sort of the first business blog and the first software blog. And you know, now I don't think it would ever occur to us to describe it this way, but now we would see it as like the sort of pioneer of content marketing.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And there was a certain openness and I don't know, vulnerability is the right word to it, but it wasn't like, hey, here's a bunch of marketing spiel about how awesome we are. It was kind of like, here are some of the things that we're dealing with and how we're trying to solve them and the problems we found along the way, and oops, we might have screwed this up. And that was so unusual back then because everyone was just like, here's our corporate BS.
Right.
Whatever.
Well, and everybody tried to present themselves as bigger than they were. One of the things that always came up to me is he was very honest about how big the team was, who was involved, what they were spending on. And I'll tell you, this is a true story. So we are about to move offices where we're at in Fall Creek. We're in downtown Manhattan with a beautiful office, you know, with a view. I'm literally looking out the window with a view of, you know, New York Harbor, and I can see, you know, Governor's Island and Statue of Liberty and all that stuff. And this is a space that Joel and his co-founder Michael built almost 10 years ago. And the reason we're having to move out is that the company had built Trello and spun it out, and it sold to Atlassian earlier this year for a whole pile of money, and they're growing. And so they're sort of taking up a bunch of space. And we're like, you keep the office, and we'll go get a new one for our team. And so that's a little bit of a bittersweet parting, but very amicable. And anyway, we're going to look for an office in downtown Manhattan, which is no small thing to try and do in the real estate market here. And the notes that I have for what we want to do with our office space are literally Joel's blog posts from 15, 16, 17 years ago, where he wrote about not just, hey, we're going to build an office for the company, but what were the values and the human considerations that informed why they did an office the way they did. And because, the specifics kind of fade away. Like I look at, enviously at that dollar per square foot rates that he quotes, and I'm like, yeah, I wish that was still numbers. But you put that away, the little details, and the big principles, the underlying principles, are still rock solid because he wrote them honestly. Because it wasn't marketing fluff, and it wasn't the sort of puffery of like making yourself seem like a big company when you're not. So it actually endures to the way where the better part of 2 decades later, I can literally use it as a reference for a task I have at hand right now to know what the founder of the company I'm trying to do justice to was thinking. And that is just I think the best testament to the power of a real sincere voice, a real great clear communicator, and the promise of what somebody can do if they're using these tools, these digital communication tools to their highest ability.
That's a great point. And I remember actually reading some of the posts about office space and sort of, if you're investing this much in these people, don't you want to make sure they're actually productive, was basically what I took away from it. Yeah.
And it's still true. And I'll be honest, I had that moment of temptation where I'm like, wow, we could save. One of the things that Joel had said early on was every programmer, every computer coder should have a office with the door that closes so they can concentrate, because interrupting them is very costly. It's hard to get back into the flow. And I know this as a coder that's true. And yet I had that moment of temptation while we were looking at office space. I'm like, wow, we could save X dollars if we just cut corners a little bit, and like we'd still have nice desks. They just wouldn't have their own offices with doors that close. And I went back to first principles, right? I went back and read the why, not just the what. Because the interesting thing that happens there is he also said in the same time, like, oh, and we'll give everybody a nice lunch for free. And we still do that. And, Google and Facebook and all those companies, they copied that. They do give free lunches and snacks and those things. They didn't do the harder part of give everybody their space and a place that closes and these sort of these real investments in respecting them. And so they copied the easy parts, or they didn't do the hard parts. And you see the cost of it, right? You see the cost of people's happiness levels. You see the sort of the barriers that go up to, whether people are willing to sort of put their best work in. And I think it was really instructive to me to be like, you know what, I can't afford to be penny wise and pound foolish, especially with what I see. This is a little company, but I see it as an institution because it's had this huge cultural impact. And so I'm like, to do justice to that as the new guy coming in is really about, like, do you, as I said before, do you hear what people say about the problem they're trying to solve and really believe that they know the way to solve it, and that all you need to do is give them what they asked for. And in this case, it's both listening to, the founder of this company, who's one of these leaders that made tech more thoughtful and mindful. And do you listen to the coders who are going to be the reason that this company exists and say what they need are the tools to do their job? And do I really believe what they say and invest in doing what they need? Or do I think I know better and I can cut a corner and it won't matter?
Right. That's a very good point. And it's funny to sort of reimagine. I remember reading that blog post when I was in an office with 3 or 4 people, and we did have a door that closed, and there were reasons for it. It wasn't supposed to be that way. There had just been rapid growth. But
yeah. I mean, there's always, and that's the thing, is it's never malice.
Right.
It's never somebody be like, I really want to, make these people suffer.
But boy, it would have been nice to have an office that you could have just closed the door and gotten your work done. And back in those days, I remember I would leave the office and I would go to a coffee shop because I didn't have a cell phone and there was no, Wi-Fi at the coffee shop. So when I had to go get stuff done, I would go there, put in some headphones so I couldn't be distracted. Now, of course, it's probably the opposite, but.
Yeah, I think that idea that we had normalized that and same reason people work from home a lot too. We'd normalized the idea that to be productive, you don't go to the office. And it's like, well, what is this office for? We're paying a lot of money for it.
Right.
Where have we built a place that makes our people less productive?
Now, you said something else that was really interesting, and I noticed this in myself and a lot of other people I talk to who kind of come from this technical background, and you would sort of think at first glance or first intuition that those people would be the ones who would be totally into direct marketing and all this stuff that's basically a bunch of math and is relatively impersonal. And for the most part, it seems like you and I and a lot of these other folks, we don't really like that. There's something about it that we just can't kind of get into, whereas we can get into the one-on-one conversations and the dialogue. What do you think that's about? Because it doesn't actually make sense to me. It feels like I should be the other way.
That's a really interesting observation. I think there's a couple parts to it. I think one is we love analytics, but we don't like being reduced to numbers. And so there's this tension there, right? Like we love what was the click-through rate? And I think that stuff really lands. But the idea that we are just an entry in somebody's database because we know what that means, I think is part of why we reject that impersonality.
That's interesting. Yeah. And then another thing you said that I thought was super interesting, that you almost said it in passing, but I want to call it out because if anyone else is going through this, you basically said when you got to New York, you kind of had partners do your lead gen for you. And so you're saying, I didn't do marketing, but I had someone else doing it for me. And I think so many people get to a place where they're like, I don't really know how to do marketing. I'm going to do the networking and the sales and the referrals and whatnot, which is great. But they don't have a strategy for having someone else bring them leads. And I think it's totally fine to outsource your marketing as long as it's working for you. But by all means, outsource it. Don't just not do it.
Yeah. I think that's the thing is I didn't realize until in retrospect, and later the business struggled, and I ended up winding that business down. And part of the reason why was I didn't have the ability to transition out of leads essentially handed to me from a partner. And granted, they took a big cut, so I was paying for them, but they were doing the work of prospecting. And when it came time to do it on my own, I did fall into that trap. I did absolutely do maybe I just won't do it. And how that turns out is that company is dead.
Okay.
And so I totally agree with you. I think there is a real impulse, and part of it is everything that's outside of our purvey, that's not on our plate, that we're handling, sometimes feels invisible. And I see this on, again, analogous to the tech world of I sound like such a fogey. I promise I'm not 100 years old, but before we had Amazon Web Services or something like that, you'd manage the servers yourself, and it was a ton of work, but you knew how it worked.
Right.
And so there's this little thing that happens now where people who've only come up in the sort of post-cloud era get into certain categories of problems, and they're like, I don't know how to solve this because I've only ever just pushed a button and gotten this resource that does whatever, that does storage for me, or that delivers emails for me, or does these other services. And it's fine. People should optimize for what they do well. I'm not saying, you should whittle your computer servers out of wood by hand and crank the generator that powers them. But I think this sort of fluency and at least one level down, one level away from what into the sort of adjacent, disciplines that you need to have, that you're dependent on, is really important. And some of that is just about respecting the people doing that work. And I think before I was more established as a marketer, which I think I have some chops in now, but when I was starting out, being able to talk to people who were good at it and respect what they did, which again, I say this as hard-earned lessons. I came in with the I know everything, I know better attitude that I think a lot of young guys do. And sort of being humbled by learning now this is really what it takes. And I think in the particular case of marketing communications, one of my early mentors, and still somebody I really revere, was a member of she was a member of the marketing team and communications team at Apple that launched the Mac.
Okay.
And and it was one of those things where even having access to her, let alone getting to work with her for years, was incredible. But the sort of quiet lessons of it took me a long time to learn. This is how you build a story that people respond to, and that the world's going to pay attention to, and that it's bigger than just here's our new features, but here's something that matters to this whole community or to this whole potential set of customers. That was stuff that really was about over months and years watching somebody do their work and sort of as an apprentice learning that discipline and growing into it. And I think being able to have the time to do that was a great luxury, and I was very fortunate to have that. I mean, that was, we talked about I didn't go to college, but the truth of it is it was people taking the time to invest in me, to let me learn at their side in these fields that were essential, that were almost invisible to me because I hadn't done them before I started that.
And I think that's a great point. And for a lot of people out there, they're probably going to say, gosh, if I could apprentice with someone from the Mac marketing team, I'm sure I would be really good at marketing also. How did you go about creating those relationships? And I think you're right. A lot of people do enjoy investing and passing their knowledge forward, but you kind of have to get the ball rolling somehow, right?
Yeah, and there is a thing where I was very fortunate. I was at a company where friends had built one of the first blogging tools called Movable Type, and it was the platform that was used to launch Gawker and Huffington Post and all these other sort of early blogs that really took off. And they hadn't really run a business before, so I went out to San Francisco to help them grow the company. And for a moment in I don't know, 2003 or 2004, they were the hot startup, getting magazine covers and doing TED Talks and all that kind of stuff that now we see all these startups do. But at that time, it was still pretty novel. There wasn't a lot of consumer internet happening then. And so we were able to attract really great talent and get people that really believed in the mission. And somebody like Jane, who was my mentor, she came saying, this is a story that feels like as much potential as the beginning of the personal computer. And I think that was true of social media broadly, even if that particular company, we didn't quite realize that potential. But I think certainly all of us that saw what social media was becoming knew that it was going to become an everyday thing and part of everybody's lives. And so, she had the knack for being able to both recognize that kind of opportunity and the willingness to mentor people who were coming up in the field. That, I look back in retrospect, and a lot of that was, sad as it is to say, I think the tech industry was more open then. We were a company that had two young co-founders, one of whom was a woman who was the CEO. That is less common now than it was then, and it's still really uncommon back then. Mm-hmm. And there are more and more barriers to that. We had until we got to almost 100 employees, we had pretty much 50-50 representation by gender within the company, including in technical roles, including in management roles. And so we'd had a very balanced company and a very, broad base of people contributing and people of different ages, which is another huge, sort of barrier in tech. And so those things were part of why I think there was a really healthy culture, a really creative culture, and a real willingness to help each other because people knew that they were bringing different skills to bear. And I think having had the chance to see and sometimes participate in companies that were much more homogenous and much more sort of monolithic in who made up the teams, it was, one, less backgrounds and less experience to share because everybody was sort of coming from one mindset. Two, much more competitive because everybody sort of zero sum. Like everybody here is just like me. I can't afford to share my knowledge with them because we're, undifferentiated, indistinguishable. And so I think those were real sort of cultural challenges that it took a while for me to learn how do you prevent those problems from happening.
right? People often think of diversity as sort of this feel good concept that doesn't actually have any benefits to them in a selfish, I'm running this company for profit way. Mm-hmm. But if you have a culture where everyone is hoarding information or not willing to be helpful, obviously that's going to impact the bottom line pretty severely. And I think you have an interesting take on how people perceive themselves when they are, they think they're interchangeable and have to rise to the top and they have to be better than their other people, versus if they are bringing something and they know that someone else is bringing something else and that everyone is going to get there together or not.
Yeah, I think people are more collaborative and generous in a diverse environment because there's less of that sense of competition. There is a sense that everybody's bringing something to the table, and it's very obvious that the different experiences are sort of connecting together. And, I see that in, having walked into Fog Creek a little over 6 months ago, the sales team here was already existing. And there's both a interesting thing. One was, this is a very technical company. It's founded by developers. All the products are for developers. It's a very, this is like software for people who make software. It couldn't be more techy. And yet there is none of the derision or condescension from the technical staff towards the sales operation. And I think that was a really pleasant surprise. I assumed that was going to be something I would have to work on. And instead there's a real interest in solving the problems. And I think that also is part of why then later on we had a big proposal going out, and it was something that sort of taxed our ability to sell. It was just a different line of business than we had sold into before, and the entire sales organization here, the sales team and sales engineers, sales reps, everything came together to come up with a proposal together. They wrote up this response to an RFP collaboratively. Even though it was like one person's commission. And I was stunned. And there was no prompting on my part. Like, I would take zero credit for this. No, this is me just watching. And I thought, there are not a dozen tech companies I've seen in my entire career, and I've seen hundreds, where that would have happened. And, so first I kind of let it play out. And of course the result was incredible because you had all of the combined knowledge of all these people sharpening and refining and improving the pitch. And did you think about this? And did you catch that? And this worked for me at this other close and whatever. All that stuff came together. And the result was great. And that really stuck with me because I sort of, individually talked to members of the team afterwards and was like, one, do you know how unusual that is? And they're all like, no, we do that all the time. I was like, that was shocking. And then the second part was like, well, how come, everybody's willing to do it? And it was interesting to me. A lot of our team had come from outside of tech. Some of them, this is their first job working in software and technology, period. Similarly, there are people, and they had done sales before, but not in tech. Similarly, there were others who had worked in tech and never worked in sales. So we had people that had come from engineering, from marketing, and decided they wanted to try their hand and were mentored by members of the team to come in and learn the culture of it. And of course the team, is pretty geographically diverse, pretty evenly split by gender, and a lot of other things. And so it was really instructive to me, and it was also a really good way for me to check my, prejudices or expectations about how sales teams work. And so very instructive in that regard too. But it was one of those moments where it was a great reminder of how much I have left to learn, one, and two, about what's possible of these assumptions we make about the ways teams work and about what incentives work in creating a sales organization that grows and thrives. It's just a very, very different thing than I think a lot of the stereotypes that conventional wisdom would tell you.
And that's a really interesting anecdote, and I had no idea it was coming. One of the questions that I was about to ask before you went into that was, well, surely the sales guys, they are cogs in a machine, and you just want the cream to rise to the top, and blah, 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 blah. And you're saying, no, even with the sales guys, even when they are getting commission, you can still foster this kind of collaboration. And I know you're being very modest and not taking any credit, but I have a feeling that there's a certain amount of credit for creating the kind of culture and the incentive structure where that happens. So other than sort of having that mix of folks and perspectives, Is there something in particular about the way the incentives work that you feel is going to foster that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll start with a technical example where a lot of the big tech companies, like Microsoft, was notorious for this for many years, do stack ranking, right? Which is evaluating your coders, putting them into buckets of top performers, average performers, below average performers. By that system's structure and metrics and definition, there have to be on your team underperformers. Everybody cannot be either acceptable or great.
Right.
And what happens is this, as you'd expect, complete zero sum, crabs in a bucket clawing for who's going to get to be in the top, or at least in the acceptable bucket, and nobody wanting to be classified as not good enough. And especially, and you end up with these really just cruel stories, these inhumane stories. And what happens is people will be like, yeah, I had to mark this person an underperformer. Like they went through a personal loss in their life, and that was why they didn't perform. But the numbers are the numbers, and I got to do what I got to do. Or variations of people currying favor to be in those other things. And so you end up with this system where the presumption of the system is this fundamentally bad assumption, and it draws out the worst behavior in people. And that was my introduction to performance evaluation systems in general. Was hearing from friends that worked at Microsoft and other companies that had similar systems about just the worst case scenarios. Because nobody, like, if you make the cut, you're like, well, the system seems fair. Yeah. Yes, I am very good. And so to that point about coders, we understand databases well enough that we never like to be a number in a system. That was really intuitively right. And I had not really managed a large sales team until another company a couple of years ago. And they had a very conventional reward structure in place. But, it's that fine-tuned balance between team rewards versus sort of personal commission and what's the motivation. And what I realized was you also have to give people enough space, enough room in your expectations of what their goals and their targets are to be able to have the bandwidth to help. Because people are inclined to. If you let them, like if there's a space and there's a room and it's not going to cost them missing their targets, missing their goals, you can give people the bandwidth to actually be able to invest in developing their peers and helping their peers. And what it is the perception, the short-term perception of these metrics we look at, like productivity per salesperson, being seen differently. Okay. And having a measure around their, and it doesn't have to be a number, but having an evaluation of and an assessment of their ability to help the entire team be more productive. And it really maps to the same lessons around software, which is this idea of like, if you have these 10x coders, these other sort of myths we have about how programmers perform, like what you're doing is you're incentivizing them to never help any other coders get better.
Right.
To never collaborate. And like, I ship this many lines of code, which is the false metric people used to fixate on. And to the point where they're going to be like, I'm going to pad out the code that I'm writing so it looks like I'm writing more lines of code. Mm-hmm. And we've all seen the same thing happen with, the salespeople that sandbag their numbers and then, miraculously at the end of the quarter, they have this close and the whole time they've been sort of ignoring whether the team is performing or not. And a lot of it comes down to trying to hyper optimize individual performers at the expense of the team. And if you can set a budget, and in the case of me as a CEO, that's a literal budget, but it can be as a manager just a time or resource budget, to where people have the ability to invest in what their peers are doing and properly incentivize that, you can get incredible results. I mean, you can see productivity lifts across your team. And the idea of what is it worth to not have any underperformers versus how do we hyper optimize for one person being an extraordinary, overperformer. Mm-hmm. It's probably a little better to have the former than the latter.
And I think even on a quarter by quarter basis, that's probably true. But as you go longer and longer term, like the amount of institutional knowledge that you can have in a functioning team where people are excited to show up and help each other, compared to a team where you have one or two lone wolves who are awesome, but a lot of the other people are churning because they just can't get traction. It just seems like such a corrosive long-term culture.
That's exactly right. And I think it helps us on retention. It helps us on bringing people in. Our onboarding is getting sharper and sharper. Turnover is lower. Like all those things are huge costs. I mean, like you can talk about, managing your team, whatever. Like there's no bigger cost than that waiting to ramp up a new hire, who doesn't know how you sell your product. Like that is incredibly expensive. You don't want to do this as infrequently as possible. Like for a new hire, sure, but because you turn somebody because they got burned or because their coworker was a jerk to them, you never want to be in that position. And I think it is that false optimization we go for a lot of times of like what we see in front of us as the expense. And I'm lucky to be at a company where we're able to think about that long term. But I think so many more companies could benefit from doing that. And it's not easy. I don't want to gloss over the like if you're a sales manager and you got to go up the ladder and be like, we're going to try and do this long-term investment and it might in the short term hurt this one overperformer's numbers where our best salesperson is going to be merely great instead of extraordinary because they're helping others. I'm not saying that's an easy case to make, but you got to try.
Yeah, and it's hard. It's very hard to jump across because everyone can see, yes, if I had a whole bunch of clones of my top performer, that would be awesome. But man, if they miss their numbers this quarter, that could sink the whole company's numbers.
Yeah, I think that's it. Is you never want to have a single point of failure in any system. And it's interesting because we learned this on tech, right? We moved to like DevOps instead of the old-fashioned systems engineering where one person ran the server, and if he was out sick that day, your system went down. And you do this, DevOps culture where everybody's sort of designing towards resilient systems that repair themselves and heal themselves, and that you see problems and anticipate them before they're caused. And that was a decades-long transition in the tech world. So that we could make systems that were not, they call it bus proofing, right? So like somebody gets hit by a bus and your systems still run, then you're okay. And the weird thing is sales culture hasn't done that to where we bus proof our sales teams. Like God forbid your top performer gets hit by a bus, or as is more likely the case in those kinds of cultures, they burn out on that and they get poached by your biggest competitor. And then you're like, oh, well, we got to rebuild our sales team from scratch. Like you don't want to be in that position. And the great thing about a more collaborative sales culture is, one, when you do onboard somebody new, there's a lot of resources they can go to, people that'll sort of help them get up to speed and help them be productive quicker. So that on-ramp is shorter and they're turning in good numbers earlier. And the second part is somebody has life intercede, like whatever, they get ill, they have to tend to something, they have anything, the normal things that happen. They're able to be plugged in, plugged out, and you can handle that. You can sort of handle the gap, and it's not this sort of like catastrophe where we're going to miss the quarter because one person's out.
I think that's such a great concept. How can you bus-proof your sales team?
I think there are so many ways that my perspective on sales would help by having come up through technology first.
What else would you say has come out of that tech background that other people who are either coming from tech and would like to feel more confident about sales, or maybe they don't have any tech background, but they should apply these lessons? What else should they be thinking about?
That is a great question. I think it actually does come down to that refrain we've hit a couple times of listening to the problems people have and really believing them. And I think about how infrequently when I was on sales teams, we actually really sat down without an agenda, without this customer is on fire, or this lead needs to close. Without an agenda, we sat down and listened to what the tech people were saying about what the product was, what the challenges were, what needs it met. And it really sat down and listened to customers without an agenda and just listened to what their problems were and tried to take that back to a product team and filter it in. Like there were not enough of those chances. And similarly, as a technologist, to sit down without the hubris of like I'm the techie and I know best. I'm the sort of genius coder here, and say, salespeople have an important role in this organization, and the insights that they have into our customers, our community, our competitors could really teach me a lot about what I'm doing, and that I have to get better at translating that into code. There's so many times I made that mistake. I literally can't even count how many times I was the full of myself guy, thinking the guy on the other side doesn't know what he's talking about. Literally when I'd been that guy.
Right.
It's just a ton of wasted time and effort. I feel bad for the people I had to work with. I think of the times I wasn't collaborative enough, and I think about now my responsibility as somebody leading a company, but also as a steward of a company I didn't found with a really special and unique culture that makes things that are really special in the world, and trying to do justice to that is about taking that responsibility seriously to say we can do something better. We can overperform. And, for us, it's life or death. We make tools for developers, and some of the other companies that do that are called Google and Microsoft and Amazon and whoever you want to name. And we're not going to exist if we take our eye off the ball and stop listening to what people want, because we can't win on marketing dollars. We can't win on, sending out the nicest gifts to people, which is literally what other, those companies like Google has a conference, they give people laptops. Like, we're not going to do that. We're a 17-year-old company that is still like not even 40 people. So what can we do to stand up in that world and make something that people love? Obviously, the technology has to be great. The product has to be great. The design has to be great. The marketing has to be great. But some of this has to be about thinking ahead to how do we have a sales experience that we're proud of, that matches the same level of fit and finish and care that we offer to our users and to a technical developer, and to say that we're going to sit down with our development team, our product team, and put them side by side with our sales team and have them sit in a room together and say, what can we learn from each other and from our customers and our community?
I think that's a great point, right? The sales, from the customer's perspective, their experience with you is the whole thing. The product, the sales experience, the support, the onboarding, et cetera. It's not just the product. And I think especially in technology, we often have this tendency to think that everything is about the product, whereas it's much broader. And if you don't invest in part of it, the customer experience is not as good, and the sales are not as good, and the product doesn't get into this tight, virtuous feedback loop about people being excited and requesting new features and so on. And it's funny you're saying these things, because I remember back when I started, it wasn't obvious to me at the time, but I feel like there was a lot of pressure on people to show that they were smart. And it was a bunch of people who had studied hard, had in most cases gone to college, or if they hadn't, they were probably even smarter. And everyone had sort of been rewarded by the quote-unquote system for knowing answers and being right.
Yeah, everybody wanted to either be a teacher's pet or was overcompensating for their imposter syndrome, or both.
Right. And so listening was not really a skill set that academic track and even the early business track, it didn't foster that somehow. And I think it's really dumb, because one of the things I've realized as I've hopefully gotten a little bit better at listening is, gosh, I learn stuff, and then when I actually go do the work, it actually solves the problem so much better than if I hadn't listened to what they asked for. Like, wouldn't it be? There are so many times where life would have been so much easier if I had just listened for a little bit.
That's such a great example. I mean, I look at, so the product that we've built at Fogcreek, the most recent one is called Glitch, and it is a collaborative coding environment. So it's like Google Docs for coding. You can go in and sit down, with somebody either in the same room as you or across the world and code at the same time, and it's instantly deployed to the cloud. So it's really cool. And the team that built it is groundbreaking, and it's amazing to watch. But there's all this like cool technological lifts. But I'll tell you, the feature that jumps out to me that it really felt unique, but also sort of epitomizes this value we're talking about, is when you get stuck. And it's not if, it's when. When you get stuck and you have an error in your coding and you have a problem, you can look at that error message, just highlight, this is the bug in my software. And there's the emoji of the person with their hand raised. And you can click that button and raise your hand and ask for help. And somebody in the community will come in and help you. They'll be like, oh, I happen to know how to use that service, that web service, and so I can help you out. And in some ways, it changed the way I saw coding. For so many years, it had been this sort of solitary, I'm going to, like we said, close the door and put your headphones on or whatever. But I realized like more and more often, it was something that I was doing for another person to consume, another person to review that code or to fix the bugs in it or to improve, or later on they would have to troubleshoot it. And so this idea that I could just raise my hand also reminded me that, like, no matter how many years you've been programming, you're always a beginner. There's always a new framework or technology or toolkit that you are like, I've never used this before. Like, what do I do? And so this, like, what I think of as a very compassionate view of giving people forgiveness over the fact that they're trying something new or that they're having to experiment and learn was really important to me. And it's what, clicked with me about Glitch, but it was also this thing that I understood about culture broadly. And I think that is something that is what I wish for as somebody that cares about sales and does does a lot of sales and works a lot with the sales team, is this idea that like that idea of collaboration and a little more of a compassionate view towards how we help each other do it could make us better at it. And that we're always beginners. We're always learning new ways to talk to our customers and to our leads. And we're always learning new ways to get better at what we're doing. But we're not going to do it alone. It's not going to be like you go off on your own and say the hell with everybody else, and that makes you a better salesperson. Like that can't possibly be the way that we get better at what we do. It has to be about just having the sort of the confidence, the courage to raise your hand and be like, I need some help. And then having the compassion or the thoughtfulness to be the person on the other end, the other end saying, I'll give it to you.
Well, in some ways, I think you don't really know something until you teach it. And so it gives people who are at that level where the next step for them is to help teach, it gives them a chance to step up and do that. And if you can do that efficiently, right, as opposed to those meetings where you have all the developers or all the salespeople in a room and you waste everyone's time for 3 hours, right? If you can just raise your hand and the right person can jump in and help, that's awesome for everybody.
Yeah, they meet you in your context and are there really to help you solve your problem and not just to sort of get you out of the way where they're like, well, if I just tell you this thing, will you go away? I think it's just a different way about thinking about it.
It's funny because I recently came back from my college reunion and I was sort of thinking wistfully about those days in the computer lab where writing a 100-line program in C might take me several days. And we were all in a lab together because I had never programmed until I got to college. And I don't know why I thought this would be a really good fit for me. But, there'd be a room of people and every once in a while someone would curse and then someone would go help and you would get through it so much more quickly than you could. And then later when you kind of got the ground under your feet, you could go off in a room by yourself and just crank on something. But there are those moments where if you were sitting in a room by yourself, nothing would get done because you would just get stuck too many times. And then I really appreciate what you guys have done with Stack Overflow. I mean, that has just changed the way people write software because you can get help from the broader internet, and it's almost like Glitch is the next level beyond that.
Yeah, I think they're very parallel efforts, and I think they're both predicated. Like Stack Overflow revealed to me that coding was social. I mean, we think of like GitHub and version control and things as that, but to me it was the idea that like the knowledge is out there. There's no bug, no problem that I have, in what I do that somebody else hasn't tackled before. If you're at the very frontiers of computer science, okay, maybe you've got something, but the bread and butter people who make a living coding, there's not something that somebody hasn't at least had a version of in the past. And I think Glitch is sort of saying, okay, now that we know that insight, that there is knowledge out there and people are willing to help, how do we bake it into the process of where we actually create, as opposed to like we go over there and move it earlier and earlier into, I always think of this as like a lot of the most joyous moments of my life were those sort of creative collaboration moments, right? And like people have that experience if they're in a band and they're playing together with somebody, or they're an athlete and they're on a team that's all sort of clicking together and or whatever. I mean, for me, like I'm a parent, I have a 6-year-old son, and like if we're doing a cooking project together, we're just making dinner, and he happens to like anticipate that I need an ingredient or a utensil, and he like brings it, and I'm like, wow, look, like he's growing up and he's really paying attention and we're in sync with one another. I think those are these sort of quietly joyous moments you have in your life where you're like really connected to somebody and making something new that didn't exist before. And so often technology has not been in that realm, where it feels like that sort of moment of creation is also a collaborative and a communal experience. And I think if we can get closer to that, that's really, really powerful. And part of the way I think we'll make in our case, we aspire for Glitch to be that kind of product. I think the way we'll make a product that feels like that is by having a team that feels like that. And that has to be true across the board, whether it's, like I said, coders or salespeople or marketers or operations and administration. Like every single part of what we do has to be suffused with that spirit for it to be true in the products that come out of that process.
Now, you raised some great points about collaboration and sort of the culture at the company, and you've also done a lot of stuff on diversity and inclusiveness. And I was wondering if you, obviously anyone wants to go to your blog, there's a lot of stuff out there. But, just sort of a high-level synopsis about kind of what we're missing and what we could be doing that would make things better for everybody. I think it's obviously easy to say, gosh, it would be good for some underrepresented group if they had more jobs.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Right. But why should people care about that if they're not in that underrepresented group?
Yeah, I think there's a couple aspects to it. I think one is, it's okay to do the right thing just because it's right. So I think we often want to ground these things in like the economic argument or some sort of like abstract rational framing. But it's okay, we don't make the economic argument for why you help the old lady cross the road, right? I think that's okay on its face. But going beyond that, I think the tech industry is in a real danger. And I say this as like I sit a block away from Wall Street when I'm talking to you right now. And when I say, if a politician says Wall Street is not, being fair to the average American, nobody's response is, well, some bankers are okay.
Right.
Right. Their feeling is that's an industry and it represents a certain thing in the world, and that's a negative thing. And the reality is there are some bankers that are okay, and there are functions that the financial system does for the economy that are valuable. But the perception of what that industry is a pretty negative one. And if you say the same thing about the media, same thing. If you say the same thing about politicians, the same thing. And right now, if you talk about Silicon Valley or tech broadly, there's this sort of mixed thing where there's like, yeah, we want our kid to be the next Zuckerberg. But on the other hand, I'm a little creeped out by, the amount of data that Google's collected about me, or I don't feel comfortable with the way that Uber treats its employees and its communities or whatever. And what I think is that's going to get worse. I think that, we look at any of these examples of automation or job displacement that are coming, like 3 million truck drivers will be out of a job by self-driving tractor trailers in America in probably the next 5 to 10 years. And that's a massive economic disruption to people in a lot of very vulnerable communities and people on the margins. And so I worry about that a lot. And I don't think they're going to say, well, some folks in tech are okay, but I don't like the folks who made the self-driving tractor trailers.
Right.
I think they're going to say those tech people took my job.
Yep.
And especially when they look at like who are the richest people in the world, right? And they're not going to say, well, some people in tech just have a job and they go every day and they clock in 9 to 5. They're going to be like, well, Zuckerberg's a billionaire and Bill Gates is a billionaire and whoever else you want to name is a billionaire, and so they're getting rich and my job is gone and that industry is the reason why. And when you see that and that they're saying, oh, well, tech jobs are the future, and then you think, well, a lot of us in a lot of different demographics, most people in America don't fit the demographic that gets hired at tech companies. Mm-hmm. They're going to say, this is really unfair. And then, of course, there's on top of that, they're like, well, I worried about my privacy. Are they taking my data? Has my password been stolen or my photos leaked out on the internet, whatever else? You put all that together, and I think there's a really, really serious danger of distrust of tech broadly. Mm-hmm. And I think tech people being very, meticulous and detail oriented think that it's going to be nuanced, and they'll say, well, this company's good and that company's bad and this person's good and that person's bad. And the reality is we're all going to get lumped into one bucket. And the thing that's going to happen, I think, in the next year or two is people are going to decide if that bucket is good or bad forever.
Okay. So we could turn into Wall Street.
Yeah, I think, in fact, we're on the course where that's most likely going to be the case. They're going to say these people made a ton of money. The rest of us got displaced or it's harder for us to pay our bills. And when all of that happens, the thing that stops that from happening, the thing that reduces that risk that Silicon Valley becomes the next Wall Street, is if we have people in the room saying, did we think about this? Did we think about that part? Did we raise this question? I look at one of the most troubling things I've seen in tech in recent years. ProPublica did a story on the sentencing software that most of the court systems in America use for determining sentencing in the criminal justice system. And it just reproduces the structural biases and the racial biases that we've seen in the judicial system for centuries, but it makes them worse. And the problem is because it's captured in software, people think it's infallible. Right? The algorithm can't be racist. Well, it's like, well, if the algorithm reflects a system that already was, then guess what?
Right.
And no, but I don't think anybody who makes that software was like, we want to make an unfair system.
Right.
I think they were like, well, let's just capture the system we have and then we'll fix the bugs. And, what you see in machine learning systems and AI and other sort of related things is they actually tend to amplify a lot of these imbalances because it's just the way that computers learn from humans. And so if somebody had been in the room who had been directly affected by being part of the criminal justice system, by having been affected in their lives, with their families, with their communities, I think it would have had a different result. I think people would have raised their hand and said, do we think about this one issue that might come from using this software, this one problem that we have that might really impact people's lives? And because I think that wasn't who was in the room making the software, they didn't feel that visceral danger, that risk to themselves, their families, their communities, their neighborhoods. It didn't come up until somebody else on the outside had to point it out. And those kinds of problems, transgressions, bugs in the software are getting worse and worse with far and far more serious social impacts. So to bring this all the way back around, when I talk about why diversity and inclusion matter, one is because it's the right thing to do, but two is because the bugs in our software are no longer about something shows up wrong on the screen or prints out wrong on the page. They're about causing real irreparable harm to people's lives and to damaging communities and damaging, opportunity for people. And the only way to stave that off is to have more people in the room with more experiences they can bring to bear of anticipating those kinds of issues and having that be part of the conversation before that software gets out in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I don't know what the right answer is. And one of the things that I noticed is I think the digital divide that everyone was worried about 20 years ago is in much better shape than I certainly thought, in the sense that so many people have internet access, they have a phone in their pocket. I was in India recently, and folks have next to nothing, but almost all of them have some type of smartphone.
Yeah,
maybe it's not the latest and greatest iPhone, but they have.
Or it's at least not a dumb phone, right? It's a moderately connected phone. I mean, I see that with my family's from one of the most rural and poor parts of India, and my cousins in the rice paddies there, they can message me on WhatsApp, and
right.
The Aboriginal families that live around that village, a family of four lives on like $600 to $800 a year.
Right.
And so, like, for them to have connectivity, more people have internet connectivity or messaging connectivity than have access to clean water now.
Right. And I guess it depends on your perspective about whether that's a good form of progress or not. But it's amazing, right?
It's a step. It's something.
And so as consumers of this technology, I think we're actually doing a much better job than I ever thought possible at being inclusive. But I think there's sort of this bifurcation between the consumers and the people who really, as you say, kind of control what goes into the technology. Just because you have a phone in a rice paddy doesn't mean that you have a lot of influence over how WhatsApp works or how Facebook is going to pursue policies with the Union government to provide internet access.
Yeah. Yeah, and also you recognize, well, the person on the other end of this phone is not getting by on $500 a year.
Right.
Right. I think that sort of visibility into like, wow, they're really, really doing well, and I'm really not changing my quality of life that much, even though I appreciate being able to communicate. And so you start to think about, like, what are the ways that we can build technology platforms that more people can benefit from? And we have some examples. I mean, I look at, Etsy or something where it's like a lot of people on that platform are getting a lot of value out of it, not just the owners of the platform.
And something that's been interesting to me as I've been doing these Sales for Nerds interviews is, as much as I like to think I've gotten over my stereotype of what the archetypal salesperson is, the archetypal salesperson is still, in my mind, male, and sort of like the jockey football player turned sales rep. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of sales rep. It's just I don't think it's a very accurate archetype. And there's, in fact, I think a disproportionate number of top performers who are women, because it kind of goes a little bit maybe more to some of the collaborative and listening skills. And some folks at HubSpot did some research where they found that a lot of the traits that we think are about sales success are not really correlated with it, or may actually be negatively correlated. And some of the things that we don't tend to think about, like being coachable, being good at listening, just being conscientious and caring about people, are the ones that are most correlated with success. And it kind of makes me wonder about, well, what are some of our other things that maybe we have our own bias, despite what we think we're being inclusive and meritocratic.
Meritocratic, yeah.
But we're actually holding back not just the people that we're working with, but our own companies by not thinking about this clearly.
Yeah, and I think that's a really I understand why people get defensive, right? I mean, I think people feel like, well, this is a zero-sum game, and when you talk about diversity, maybe you don't mean me, and so you're inviting people into the room that's not me, and that's going to hurt me. And I think that's actually part of that same, thing we talked about with how you build a sales team, where there's got to be one star and everybody else is in danger of getting cut. And all of these things are about this cultural transformation towards an idea that it doesn't always have to be one winner and everybody else loses. There could be a way where we're all helping each other, get ahead. And that's I think we're having this moment of reckoning in American culture broadly of, which of these societies do we want to kind of try to be going forward. And I think about it a lot. It's like the idea that, it's a free for all and there's only ever one winner and everybody else has to be defeated. It's like, eventually people figure out you're not going to win every time. And, we all take turns being the not winner.
Right.
And sometimes because of things out of our control. Like I said, it's human stuff. You get sick, you have a kid, you go on vacation, like any normal thing, you stub your toe and all of a sudden it's your turn to take the fall. I think building systems that are resilient is valuable to people. And it's such an interesting thing because tech finally turned this corner. You see things, like I said, like a DevOps culture where we're supporting building infrastructures that are resilient, or you see things like open source where we're assuming we're going to be able to collaborate together, or you see things like bug bounties where you rely on your community to help you with security. We've built collaborative cultures. With things like Stack Overflow, we're all going to answer each other's questions, and nobody's like, I'm going to hide my answer. You can't know how to solve this problem in your code. Like, we've seen the benefits of collaborative culture in some parts of tech. And we need to extend that out into the other aspects where we have somehow hit this much more defensive and unwilling, uncooperative kind of mindset or standpoint.
Yeah, and I can't remember if it was you or Joel had an article about, what's wrong with the whiteboard interview for coders.
I was responding to his post about it, but yeah, we both sort of contributed on that.
And, someone who has written who used to write a lot of code on whiteboards, and sometimes I would do great and people would think I was brilliant, and sometimes I would do terribly and people would think I was an idiot. It's such an arbitrary way of evaluating whether someone is going to be a useful developer. And I think there's similar challenges to interviewing salespeople and marketing people and so on. And I'm not saying there's any one right or wrong way of doing it, but we sort of have these systems that we perceive as being unbiased.
Yeah.
That have considerable bias built into them, which is not only unfair to the people that we're recruiting, but also is limiting our own company's performance, which I think...
Yeah, it cuts off the potential. I mean, that's the thing is like, one, as a candidate, God forbid you didn't eat your Wheaties that morning and all of a sudden you're like out of the running. But as a company, to turn away the potential of great, talented people, because if you talk to your best performers on your team and ask every single one of them, did you ever blow an interview? And every single one can say yes.
Yep.
Every single one is like, yeah, there was one time when I really should have had it and I just was off that day, or I didn't sleep, or my girlfriend just broke up with me, or whatever, it just happened. And they'll be like, yeah, and you're like, wow, somebody missed out on hiring somebody as great as you because of that totally arbitrary reason. Glad that never happens here.
Right.
And of course it does, right? And so I think being able to, like I said, build these resilient systems, and the epiphany for me on how to build scalable, large-scale social web systems was, you assume the hard drive will fail sometimes. You assume the RAM will fail sometimes. You assume the power will fail sometimes, and you build redundancy and resiliency into your system. And it's obvious, nobody would build a single point of failure architecture for any technology that they wanted to sell on the market today.
Right.
Right? And then you talk about, well, you've got all these single points of failure in recruiting, in retaining talent, in training your sales team, in encouraging your sales team to be high performers, in getting yield out of them and improving efficiency over time. Every single one of those, you build a single point of failure, and you're like, why does it keep having this trouble?
That's a very good point. And I think, when I was trying to say earlier, well, why do people want to do this for themselves? It's not that we shouldn't want to do the right thing. It's that I feel like so many people feel like they're doing their best, and they're stressed out, and they don't, they're an expert in whatever their business is. They're not an expert in inclusiveness and so on. But I think it gets people's attention a little bit more when you say, hey, you're missing out on great people, and you're missing out on the growth of your own company if you don't think a little bit about what kind of lens you're looking at your especially your people pipeline through.
Yeah. And I think that's such a that it's taken us a while to even have a language how to talk about it is the telling thing, because this is about cultural change. None of it, like the I can make all the spreadsheets in the world, and I can make the case with as many charts and graphs as I want, and the hard part of it comes down to you're dealing with people and you're dealing with culture, and you have to have people that are willing to go on that trip with you. And there, it's a hard thing. Like, I think one of the reasons we've been able to do some of this, the start of this, where I'm at Fall Creek, is that a lot of people were from either outside of sales or outside of conventional sales, and certainly outside of the tech industry as well. And I think those things were very helpful because they didn't come with those preconceptions. But if you don't have the luxury of starting from scratch, starting from those things, being able to have that conversation, and get ready for a challenging, reckoning with your team to be able to start to change. I think it's akin to the cultural change we're having around, like when we started having conversations around being more inclusive in our recruiting on tech. Like we had to do some process changes that were uncomfortable for people, and we had to acknowledge about, like, our team is very homogenous. Like, we're in New York City, and our team does not look like New York City.
Right.
And and so, like, how do you reckon with that? And then simple stuff. And the part is, like, all of these are actually fairly solved problems in other disciplines. So we talked about, like, the Rooney Rule in the NFL. It's like for every open rec for a job that you put up, you make sure that you've got at least one underrepresented candidate who's interviewed before you hire. And the simple rationale in this, like, doesn't mean they're going to get the job. It just means, like, if you never interview any underrepresented candidates, can guarantee you're never going to hire any.
Right.
And so if you just have and it's literally, I tell people, like, they're coders, I'm like, it's a non-zero binary. Like, you just simply have to say, like, at least one person from any of these categories that are underrepresented at our company got interviewed and considered. And then whatever, fair shake. Like, the rest of the process doesn't have to change. It would be a pretty good process for evaluating people. But those things, like, that wasn't some huge thing. But to get there, the culture change, even where people were receptive, like, they were willing, they were like, oh, gosh, well, we're going to have to, ask people how they identify. And we're going to have this internal conversation about, like, how do we do that? And it was like, yeah, it takes some work. It definitely takes some work. But it pays off for all the reasons we talked about, because you end up with this capability that now we're permanently upgraded.
Right. And it's interesting, kind of tying back to the start of your career, where your mentor put you through sales training, even though you were supposed to be setting up printers.
That's exactly right.
Right. And it's like, if you can take somebody and give them some basic set of skills to do a job, maybe not at the level of a top performer, but in a way that they can contribute and be useful easily, you don't necessarily have to find the sort of the handful of superstars out there. You can take people who are good and hardworking and help them get there quickly. And then, kind of to your earlier point, you don't have the single point of failure, because you have a much bigger pool of people that you can recruit, retain, grow, and so on.
Or cross-train or whatever. And I mean, in my case, I was a skinny teenager with no experience, zero. And certainly hadn't even known I was interested in these sorts of things. And he took the time to invest in me learning those skills. And years later, after I'd started my first company, he ended up working for me. And so it's one of those things where, like, the opportunity that comes down the road, you never know what you set yourself up for. That there's a lot of opportunity that comes from just being able to, invest in people's potential and in their futures.
So do you put new developers through sales training at Fog Creek now?
We don't yet. That's something that's definitely on the list. One of the things we're thinking about, and we think about this broadly because we also are trying to get stronger at marketing and communications and other things. And, like, we're a company that's always been good at that, but it's basically because we've had founders who are, like, brilliant at it. And so as they've been busy with their other companies that spun out, it's how do you inculcate this ability more broadly? And so we've been thinking about this in terms of paths between almost all of our teams. So we're thinking about between support and sales, between development and sales, between marketing and support, and, like, so all these sort of different disciplines that are seen as related or sometimes even intentional with one another, being able to connect the dots so they see themselves as having common cause. That's actually one of the projects I find most fun, is, like, connecting the dots between those things. And and that's not to say we're nailing it. I mean, I think candidly we have a lot of communications challenges because these are teams that historically have been, the old model. We were done with this, we'll throw it over the wall to you, now go sell it. I think that's something that we're still learning to navigate past.
Awesome. Well, Anil, I could actually go on for quite some time. It's just such a fascinating conversation, and some of the stuff I've thought about before, but not as deeply as you have, and some of it is just brand new for me. So I hope it's as useful for the audience as it's been for me. And for folks listening, you can obviously go to the show notes, but you can find Anil at anil-.com, or he is a prolific Twitter person, again, at twitter.com/Anil-, and we'll have links in the show notes. Anil, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the perspective of the show and connecting, these different disciplines together, and it's really a privilege to get to be part of it.